is Rory Broomfield. He's the leader of the Freedom Association, also the Better Off Out campaign, and he's going to talk about a libertarian future following Brexit, I believe.
No, absolutely, thank you, Dan. And yes, that is my brief, looking at free trade post-Brexit. And well, thank you, I should say, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to come out. The first speaker of the year, you know, it was said earlier, I'm setting the bar. High or low, we'll see. But certainly it's a key topic of discussion now, of course, in the British political field to do with Brexit and what happens next. And this is, I think, an opportunity for the UK to take hold of its future and to see what it wishes to effectively define itself going forward outside the European Union, with a whole range of opportunities and competences that it be taking back control of. And we'll see certainly what the political masters in Whitehall and in Westminster do in the forthcoming months and years, and to do with what they have in store and in plan. But the first thing I should do is kick off with a bit of description of the Freedom Association. TFA for short has been around for 40 years, indeed over 40 years. We were set up by the founders of the Guinness Book of Records, the McWhirter twins, along with Lord Delisle and General John Gourier, to fight what was then the topic of the day, which was the closed shop in the union markets, in the labour markets in the UK. And from then, 40 years ago until now, we fought the good fight for freedom across a whole range of different subjects, from that labour market opening up and workers' rights, right the way through to the Better Off Out campaign, which Dan rightly said that I also lead and direct. But I would say that we do a lot on university campuses across the UK, as I've just said. We hold events across the UK, especially in conjunction with our freedom societies at many different universities. Also link in with other universities, and are invited to speak to universities like UCL today. And so thank you for that invitation. But it's about spreading the message, the pro-liberty message, the pro-individual versus the state, which I think is very distinctive now, and it's certainly needed at universities across the UK, where you have a number of socialist societies, a number of student unions promoting a different agenda, a different want, and I think we need to continue the battle to open up free discussion and free debate at universities across the board on many different discussion areas. And today, as I said earlier, I was asked to discuss free trade and Britain's post-Brexit future. And I think, of course, we have positive possibilities and opportunities to go forward with. But I would just like to say, first kicking off, in terms of the free trade debate, this is nothing new in the UK. In fact, it goes right the way back to the 19th century, in 1830, when the Anti-Corn Law League was set up with politicians like John Bright and economists like Richard Cobden. And that was a campaign of the day to fight against the protectionist and imperialist policies of the then British government. And the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 marked a revolution in trade and trade policy for the United Kingdom and indeed the world. And it's actually fundamental to look at what has happened since then. And back in the day, in the 1850s, it was estimated that 1.2 billion people inhabited the earth, just under 18 million in the United Kingdom. Go forward to today, and you have over 7 billion in the world, and over 60 million living in the UK as well. Now, of course, that's not just down to free trade and the repeal of the Corn Laws, but actually it marked a fundamental difference from the previous agenda of governments in the UK and elsewhere to the future agenda. And as a result, people have been fed, clothed, vaccinated, transported, educated, and advanced through free trade, through the free market. It's led to actual benefits to society, not just in the UK, but globally, by governments and people adopting this measure. Indeed, it's fundamental to talk about the principles of this, because free trade, in my view, in the free market, has actually helped to protect people against tyranny and dictatorial governments, because ultimately these governments were powerless against market forces and the choices that individuals made voluntarily against their centralized system. So from Soviet Russia to Venezuela, you have a whole range of examples where socialism has failed. Socialism, communism, central planning, central distinct planning for people has fallen on its face in the face of global market forces and the choice of people in those countries. Now, of course, there's some way to go in Venezuela, as with other countries around the world, but it's an example of socialism failing time and time again. Central planners failing to cater for the wants, needs, and desires of people under their control. And of course, it's a good point to make here that the UK is not free trading and a perfect free market system. We have many protectionist barriers in the UK and exist, obviously, elsewhere in the world. And one of them, of course, is the European Union. The EU is a protectionist racket. It is an inward-looking, tariff-loving body that's sclerotic and engages in a regulatory framework that stops Britain and the British people from realising our potential. And this is, I think, fundamental to the argument of why we took back control and left the EU, at least voted to leave the EU last year. Because people recognised that British needs, wants and desires were not fulfilled by those in the EU. That they weren't democratically elected, that they weren't accountable, but more so that the rules that they brought into place did not fit the future that the British people wanted for themselves. And I think it's fundamental also to discuss what that future is with the European Union. The European Union wants to go on a future of ever closer union. It wants to further protect itself from the rest of the world. It wants to introduce, as was seen by Monsieur Juncker's speech the other day, and indeed Macron as well, setting out the plans for banking union and further regulations, indeed a treasury that the EU and Donald Tusk wants to realise in a not too distant future. So we're freeing ourselves from this. We're freeing ourselves from the cost of this and the opportunity cost that it presents being a member. Because outside the world is growing. Outside, many countries are adopting free market and free trade policies that mean that they outcompete UK companies and EU companies in the wider world. The cost base to being in the EU outweighs the opportunity of being outside of it, in effect. And that cost has been estimated over many years. So just before the referendum, the think tank Open Europe produced the 100 most costly EU regulations, a document that was well publicised at the time, and I believe was amounted to something like £33 billion to the UK economy. Now that's actually change in comparison to an economy of £1 trillion. But other studies, like the study conducted by Patrick Mimford, professor at Cardiff Business School, and another separate study conducted by Professor Tim Condon, economist at the University of Buckingham, both estimated that the total cost of the EU's protectionist measures came to something like 7% of UK GDP. Indeed, Professor Mimford argues that outside the EU, in world prices, the UK, with its dynamism and its productivity that would come of the efficiencies that would be made, will, in effect, have cheaper goods, services, and more efficient economies that can compete on the global market. In effect, by adopting free trade policies without the onerous regulations, food and clothes and other basic staples at world prices will be cheaper, according to his analysis. And it's important to think about that analysis, because indeed it's and the concept that costs that we could be shedding after we leave the EU. It's important because we have a whole range of opportunities outside the EU that don't present when we remain. And one of those opportunities is to leave the customs union and to make our own trade deals with countries around the world. And that's on tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers alike. Now, leaving the customs union is incredibly important. It's because the customs union is a protectionist element of the EU. It puts tariffs on goods coming in from outside the EU, and as a result, makes economies around the world poorer and stops competition and choice from happening within the EU. It is fundamental for us, firstly, to leave this union, but also recognise what it has done to the UK. Because, and indeed, I should say, the rest of the world. It's fundamentally important to recognise the astonishing fact that it's now cheaper to buy roasted coffee from Germany, a country that doesn't grow its own coffee, than it is from countries in Africa, Asia, and South America. The reason is EU tariffs. There are 7 tariffs on roasted coffee right now, which means that basically farmers from outside the EU cannot sell on a fair basis against farming and indeed manufacturers from within the EU, again proving the protectionist barrier that the EU realises and actually establishes. So, in effect, customers like you and I have to pay more, as it will always go back to the customer, and inflation and what have you will be reflected in this, that we don't have the choice and we don't have the price competition that we would otherwise have. But it's important also to recognise that that's not the only protectionist measure the EU has put in place. And it's certainly not the only protectionist measure we could shed after we leave. Because, as I'm sure I was speaking to Dan earlier, the example of New Zealand shows that in agriculture, there's huge benefits to be made from shedding the subsidies that governments place and put on the farmers. Now, I say governments place and put on farmers because ultimately in the EU there's something called the Common Agricultural Policy. This is the modern day corn law, in effect. It is protectionism and government price fixing through another means, through subsidising with taxpayer money farming in the European Union. Again, shutting out competition from outside, again posing another barrier to fair competition from other places around the world. The Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, gives about 8 billion of UK taxpayer money to principally Eastern European and French farmers, and in doing so, actually gives subsidy to British farming competitors even within the European Union. Outside the EU will be outside the Common Agricultural Policy, and indeed being able to subsidise or not subsidise the markets that obviously many people are in. Now, this is important because it's the choice element here. It's whether we keep the subsidies the same, increase the subsidies, or indeed, if the government feels particularly masochistic, to nationalise all agriculture, as has happened in communist and socialist countries around the world. Now, obviously, I don't want that to happen. And obviously, I'm here to make the case for free trade. But it's important to recognise that with the nationalisation of farms elsewhere, it has led to famine, starvation, and actually destruction of whole communities in countries like China, countries even in Vietnam, although now with dynamism in the 21st century, they have experienced the famine and starvation that has been resulted in centralised planning. But, here's the big but. The UK can follow the New Zealand model. The New Zealand model that has led to an explosion, an absolute gigantic improvement in the lives of New Zealanders since the 1980s onwards. So the left-leaning government in New Zealand in 1984 decided that farming should not be subsidised. That it couldn't effectively give the farmers what they needed in terms of the costs that they were demanding. This actually has led to a huge improvement, not just in the lives of those in the industry, which has grown exponentially since the 1980s. It has improved yields, it has improved export market opportunities, it has improved the wealth of the entire nation, so as to mean that the average per capita GDP of New Zealand is roughly the same as the UK's. It's a developed market in the OECD that has got rid of subsidies and has led to an absolute improvement, a definitive improvement in people's lives in New Zealand. That is something absolutely to remember when you hear the new New Zealand Prime Minister saying that capitalism has failed New Zealanders. She is quite wrong in that assertion. She is dead wrong in that assertion. Because as a result of getting rid of subsidies, New Zealand couldn't just compete in the world market. They could compete on their unique selling points and expand their market opportunities to benefit the people of New Zealand and also the consumers in the countries that they were selling in. More choice, lower prices, more competition, actually an advancement in people's abilities and indeed choices on the market. Now, I've got a number of things to say about other models, indeed other countries that have adopted free market and expansionist models that have worked. Indeed, I recommend a book written by a friend of mine, J.P. Fleurou, called Heavens on Earth, that maps the line of different countries around the world and at different time periods and analyses why countries do well, why countries do poorly, why the people of those countries succeed and why they fall back. And I'm going to give away a secret here. It's regulation. Countries succeed, and people succeed in those countries who are free to do so. If you're free to set up your business, if you're free to exchange voluntarily your goods and services with others, then you will do more of it, you'll do it better, and you would be able to charge, as a result, more money, which will be able to command a greater proposition for inward investment for that country, and in fact, create a better life for you, your family, and indeed your wider community. It's not exactly rocket science, but governments over the years have failed to recognise the mass benefits of the free market and individual choice. But an example of a country that has succeeded in the service industry is, of course, Singapore. Very different in terms of civil liberties tradition, I know, but Singapore has gone from a rock off Malaysia to a global financial hub. It is one of the freest countries in the world economically, according to the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, and for good reason, because it has very few regulations above and beyond the global standards to impede and produce a cost for the businesses and individuals that locate and operate out of it. It effectively allowed, by not having these regulations and setting up the infrastructure, it allowed a boom of inward investment into Singapore. Now, a few years ago, in 2013, the government conducted a balance of competencies review in the UK. That was to see whether the UK government had got it just about right, not quite enough, or too much in terms of what they'd given away to the European Union. And the Freedom Association put in around 10 or so different submissions to that review across government departments. And one of them was one I wrote on trade and investment. And I took Singapore as an example. And the figures that were available at the time from 2003 to 2013 showed that in that 10-year period, inward investment in the financial sector, Singapore, capital flows into Singapore, didn't just double, didn't just treble, they increased tenfold over that period. That's not 10%, that's not 100 or 10 million, that is tenfold from year 10 from year 0 to year 10. An astonishing boom, an enormous contribution to the Singaporean economy and to the economy of that region. And it's worth analysing why that was. Why? Because yes, other countries wanted to invest in developing economies. The economy did change in that time. Remember, in 2007 there was the start of the financial crisis. But people were looking for opportunities and indeed solid investment areas to put their money, to grow their money, and to, in effect, have a return that would be invested elsewhere into the wider economies, whether they be in the UK or in Southeast Asia. Now this, I think, is a very interesting understanding of how free markets and free trade works, because ultimately it allowed for the flow of capital from one area of the world to another and back again, and allowed for companies, small or large, to invest in their future and the future of their communities. The point here is that capital is global. It's not regional, it's not local. It is a global phenomenon where hot money can go from one area to the next very easily. And the UK has a chance to reclaim itself and be the global hub for the future, because it's already now the top financial hub according to recent studies. It can enhance that position going forward, free from what's coming from the European Union in the banking union and regulations therein. I want to mention here a point about the free trade that has been bandied around, especially in light of the election of Donald Trump last year. Many people in academia, especially in the conservative movement in the US, the UK and elsewhere, feel that free trade and free markets pose a threat to culture. An understanding that Coca-Cola or American music can disrupt localized competition. I think that actually the free market, if allowed to develop, if allowed to be free, can actually enhance culture. And the reason why I say this may be slightly controversial, but if you remember, free market is the voluntary exchange of certain goods and products that people need or want or desire. That is effectively what it is. It's not centrally planned, it's not dictated from on high. Culture as well as evolution of communities, of thoughts and what have you. Now, we've seen, in my view, in plenty of areas, the development of products that signify, signal and indeed embody the principles of those countries. It, in effect, when applied to business and marketing, culture adds a branding element. So you see this with, say, Scottish whisky, or whisky in Ireland and Scotland, genuinely developed in many areas as a Scottish product, and indeed soft power to be able to project in different countries around the world. This is something that embodies the Scottish spirit, for want of a better word. Now, you have a market in whisky that's developed now with Japan and with America in bourbon especially coming into the market, looking to get sellers, looking to effectively provide the market with new products. Now they do so, again with their advertising, in a way that puts forward the cultural element of their countries. Take another example. Take watchmaking. In the 1980s and 1990s, Japan came on the scene with quartz watches and digital watches. Huge innovations, changed the market incredibly. Indeed embodied the understanding of innovation and new tech that Japan was then to be known for. As a result, culture was in effect taken, branded, and sold abroad. A huge benefit to the nation when talking about globalization and talking about looking to get inward investment from other countries around the world, other countries, other companies, other individuals. Huge benefits with regards to soft power, in effect. So, Coca-Cola, drunk around the world, is synonymous with the American brand. And it acts for America as it does with other products for other countries in a way to enhance cultural understanding of what America, what Japan, what Scotland stands for, what it is, and gives people an opportunity to talk about differences. Differences are seen by many people as bad. In fact, in this case, differences can enhance choice, competition, market environment, and understanding by basically giving countries and people within these countries the choice and chance to explain the story that has developed. So, again, going back to whiskey, Johnny Walker, a perfect example of branding, where they had a famous actor just go on a walk for one of their advertisements and telling the story of Johnny Walker and indeed the wider Scottish area in Kilmarnock in Ayrshire. And that was very powerful, and it was a very successful campaign because it combined cultural understanding and indeed difference. It marked itself out as being from the area and embodying the values of that area, and indeed Scotland as a whole, and selling on the open market. And you can see it on YouTube. It's a very successful campaign a few years back, but shows that culture can actually be enhanced through the free market, and indeed help products be sold, choice to be made, and competition to thrive. I just want to mention a few things about the possibility of leaving the EU as a result of the vote last year. Because what we are leaving is something that is highly prized by a particular section of society. Many people feel that the EU is an inclusive club, that cultures are celebrated, that people are free, in effect. Well, those people, I would say, have been told something by the 1%. The global elite, in this case of not the Soroses just, but more likely the Tony Blairs and the Michael Bloombergs and the Hillary Clintons, where actually this body, this organisation, is seen by them as a global, corporatist maybe, hub and benefactor, but by the rest of the country, certainly in the UK, as something that has taken away opportunities from them and their families. Whether it be in the northeast of England, whether it be in the southwest, it has, as a result of a global mentality, well, not a global mentality, a regional mentality, of trying to tie countries to certain regulatory standards and diminish, as a result of the understanding of ever closer union, cultural norms and cultural connections. It has sought to overrun, I think, a basic tenet of the free market, which is choice. And people had the choice last year to leave the EU, to mark in the sand, or indeed in the ground, what they were about. And this is an opportunity to, when leaving the EU, to realise what the UK is and what it can be through projecting its culture onto the world stage in a positive way, embodying through the innovations and the technical expertise that we have in many sectors, not just in finance, but in agribusiness, in manufacturing, in university education, and research. We have, through leaving the EU, an ability to take back control, not just of our regulations, but the future as a people. The philosopher Roger Scruton, during last year's referendum, talked about we, the concept of we. the understanding that we stand for something, that there are shared values that in a way can be embodied through the free market. This is the chance for the UK to project the concept of that onto the global stage and continue to do so in the face of EU protectionism and indeed inward looking. I'll stop it there, but thank you very much for allowing me to speak, giving you my thoughts, and are there any questions?